Alan Mortenson, and I live here at Ardmore Avenue at Epsilon House. This isn't just about me. This is about 12 million servicemen who served in World War II. I would hope that you would remember that several of the people from Ripon should be recognized. Bob Tila was in the 101st Airborne and landed D-Day. He was also in the Battle of the Bulge. He had a chance to get in Operation Market Basket, which was one of the great tragedies of the war. I would also note that there was a fellow by the name of Donnie Ryerson. He was captured by the Germans in the Battle of the Bulge, and he was railroaded back into Germany for a prison camp. And whether or not he was subject to our own air forces trying to take German train cars out or not, I'm not sure. But as part of history, that is what happened. I would also note that one of the fellows who is buried up in Napieskum is Charles Lindbergh. He was a Marine serving on Iwo Jima and was wounded. He was on a hospital ship on its way back to Guam when he died on February 23rd, 1945. He was an individual who was subject to be buried at sea. What they do is put you in a canvas bag, put some weights in, put you between a stretcher and a flag, and then they raise the stretcher up and you slide into the sea. There's a marker at Napieskum that says, Charles Lindbergh, buried at sea. So note, if you will, that this isn't about me alone. This is the story of many, many veterans who could tell their own stories if you wanted to hear them. Now, as far as I was concerned, I was a sophomore in high school, had finished that year, and joined the Marines when I was 16 years of age. They gave me a physical down at Milwaukee, sent me back home, and when I turned 17, they called me in for service. When I got down to Milwaukee, I found that there was a whole passenger car load of Marine recruits, and we were on our way to California, to the Marine Corps base at San Diego. We traveled by the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railroad. And there was a couple of experiences by that trip. One of them is climbing the edge of a plateau to get to the new height and seeing a train going in different directions at the same time. So you see an engine going to the right, we are going to the left, and then you saw trailing cars that were going to the right again. So that was an experience. Another thing was the Paul Harvey restaurants along the way. They stopped the whole train, and then the people could go into the restaurants. As Marine recruits, they didn't let us go. They brought us out egg salad sandwiches. But those Harvey restaurants were a time when the train crews could take on water, coal, check the journals on the wheels, and grease what needed to be greased so the train could go on. The other thing I remember is when we got down into New Mexico, suddenly went from snow in the highlands to very warm weather down below. Eventually we arrived at San Diego and the Marine Corps Recruit Depot. There we learned Marine discipline, Marine tactics, and we went to the rifle range at Camp Matthews to try out the M-Run rifles. I happen to be a sharpshooter. The best rating is excellent. Second best is marksman. So I was right in the middle of it. But I was firing from a handicap because I'm left-handed, and the training was all in right-handed. And so you had to make the adjustment in that short period of time in favoring the rifle. After graduating from the Marine Recruit Depot, I went on leave. But one of the things that surprised me was that even though all those people had been recruited into the Marines, there was one company called a scavenger company. And what they were is people who had failed to meet the qualifications to serve as Marines. Those people were let out of the gates on a given time, and they wore a uniform that was made out of gunny sacks. It was a suit, but it was the cheapest suit that you possibly could have. But anyway, they were out of service forever. In our case, from there, we returned from leave to Camp Elliott, and then almost immediately were taken to Camp Pendleton. We were given the option of going to different kinds of Marine arms school. And I was selected to go to machine gun school. And that took place in the way back country of Camp Pendleton at what is called Tent Camp Little Tokyo. This is what that tent camp looked like. There was nothing but sand underneath the individual tents. And when we actually ate at a table rather than sitting down. So those are all pictures I took. And by the way, as we talk about pictures, I went on 3-day pass to Los Angeles, and they went to the USO. And there was an older lady there, not real old, but older. And she said, "Is there anything that you could use, Marine?" And I said, "I'd like to get a camera," because you can't get cameras at that time in history. She said, "Well, I have one, but I could sell it to you." And so I think it was either $6 or $5 or something like that. And I got a little box camera, a Kodak unit. And I used that throughout the war. And so I have pictures of Japan, I have pictures of Iwo Jima, and I have pictures of the various camps that we were at. Now, years later, when the newsletters came out for my unit, I always submitted pictures to the newsletter. And so there is a whole collection of them in the archives of Company F that my buddy Rondero had out in California. But many of them are pictures that I had that nobody else had at the time. Now, our machine gun training went on for a few weeks, and then in August of 1945, the 5th Marine Division was shipping out to Hawaii. And I was one of the individuals who was taken out of the replacement platoon or company there with the machine guns. And I found myself in the evening entering into Camp Pendleton. And almost immediately I was selected for a detail to go and help load a ship down at San Diego that would take us to Hawaii. So I learned something about timbers to make sure that trucks and jeeps and artillery pieces didn't bounce around at the bottom of a ship because they were all secured. Now, in leaving San Diego, the one thing I remember most is the sun was setting as we were leaving the port city. And our ship was already in the dark. But because the sun was shining above there, I could end up seeing San Diego and back. And all of the Pueblo-type construction and houses and the tile roofs on the homes. So that was my last look at Hawaii, or at California. Now, I think about it many times, but there were all those Marines who were aboard that same ship who never had the opportunity to look back and see what I saw then, because they ended up either being killed or wounded on Iwo Jima. Now, we sailed on the Mortenson liner. It was a steamship. And although there were various precautions taken so there was no light that would shine through the portholes or through the doors or galley into the galley or elsewhere, we basically were sailing on this ship. For my buddy, Nyland Nelson, it was an experience he couldn't take because he was seasick. And worst of all, he got assigned to galley duty. And he was cleaning greasy equipment. And he would come up and heave, go back down to work. And all I could do was smile. But it was an example of what it was in the way of assignments. The sea is one smell, land is another smell. And when we got close to Hawaii, I saw a pimple show up above the seascape. And the pimple grew into a mound. And all of a sudden, the mound turned into a very steep, pointed hill. And then all of a sudden, I recognized that there was the city of Hilo down below. It also brought with it smells. And the smells of land are there. Hawaii grew orchids, and you could smell orchids. They had sugar cane, so sugar cane in bloom also gives a smell. They had coffee plantations, so you could have smell of coffee. They had strawberries that grew year-round on the mountains at various levels, so there were always strawberries blossoming. They also grew a type of woody banana, so they had those too. So that's part of going to Hawaii. Once we got to Hilo, we had the assignments of going up to the Camp Camuella or being left behind to help unload the ship. I was one of the fortunate guys to be assigned to stay back and store artillery shells on the airport at Hilo. One of the things you should know about Hawaii is that at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the clouds have reached their highest point, or the apex, and all of a sudden what ends up happening is it starts to rain. And it rains with a great ferocity. Well, you can imagine stowing artillery shells in the middle of a rainstorm. We got soaking wet, the artillery stores got stowed, and then a truck came and took us up to Camuella. Now that's on the Parker Ranch, and the Parker Ranch is the biggest cattle ranch in the United States. A lot of people think it should be in Texas, but it's actually in Hawaii. And Camuella's ranch site was called Camp Tarawa because the 2nd Marine Division had fought on Tarawa, and when they returned to take over this camp, they named it for themselves and their action. At Camuella, we trained for the Iwo Jima operation. One of the things we noticed is the 28th Marines would be always climbing a hill in the Kola Hills, one that stuck out right in front. We couldn't figure out what they were doing over there. In our case, they took us down to the beach and with amphibious tractors landed us at the coastal shore, told us to go in 1,500 feet and to make a turn to the right. We didn't know what that was about either. We also set out cloth as a forewarner for the air support, and then the Air Force of the Marine Corps came in and flew flights in front of us and dropped dummy bombs to demonstrate to us coast air support. The other thing that we noticed was that we would swim in the sea before the amphibious tractors came in, and then when the amphibious tractors brought us in, next to my amphibious tractor was a 10 or 12 foot long shark. It had come in alongside of our alligator tractor. Now these sharks were feeding on garbage because all of the garbage that was left over from feeding our troops was carried out to sea by the alligator tractors. And when they dumped that material, because the tide or trade winds swing around the island, they bring the garbage back toward shore, and the sharks feed on it. Our training went on until December 31st, 1944. And on December 31st, 1934, we went down to Hilo by truck, and we loaded on to the Highlands, APA 119. We were on our way to Iwo Jima. Going on sea is a combination operation. Sometimes it's as smooth as glass. The only thing you would see is a wake of the ship from the prow, and then sailfish would sail out from the side, and they would eventually land in the water. There would be a hesitation, and then another sailfish would do the same thing. On the other hand, it could be very rough, and the ship would look like it was falling into a deep canyon. When that happened, the front of the ship would go down, the tail end of the ship or aft would raise up, and then the screws would actually hit the water, and it would make a real grinding, loud noise, and then we would fall back into the sea again. We often thought in terms of how good the welders must have done their work, because if they hadn't done so, the ship would have broke apart. In fact, I went to visit one of the guys in my background service, and he was up at the fore part of the ship. And when the ship would go through that type of action, the steel would just squeal because of all the tension it was under. But it's an example of the Liberty ships that were built by the Kaiser Company and carried us into the war. We crossed various date lines. On January 25th, we arrived at Kwajalein. I always remember that because of the fact that the lagoon was very quiet at that time. The ship's captain was traveling too fast. We were headed for a tanker that was going to take on oil for us, and we crashed into it. And the sailors on board that tanker, not knowing that we could be setting them on fire, were very, very angry about the whole thing, and they let our captain know in no uncertain terms what they thought of him. But the thing is, we did stop. They lowered the lost howitzers and the hoses, and we took on fuel. On January 31st, we crossed the international date line, and on February 14th, we arrived off from the coast of Tinian. And at that stage, we ended up going down the landing nets. That transfer was one of the things that was trying for us. The reason behind it is the trade winds blew in with waves against Tinian. And because the water off Tinian is very deep, and it's a cliff-like formation. When the waves would hit against the cliffs, they would rise way up. And then after rising way up, they would come back down. And they came back down under the highland, but the Higgins boat, which was alongside, which was going to pick us up when we came down the net, would drift very high away from the ship. And even though the motorman was working overtime to try to keep us in position, he found it almost impossible to do so. And so all of a sudden you'd find that your footing on the landing net wasn't there. And right above me was Peter J. Rondero with his BAR, Browning Automatic Rifle. It slipped off his shoulder. It passed my head. It went through the netting, ended up in the water between the Higgins boat and the ship. But what was interesting is how steep and the gradient was. Because one minute we were up even with the ship and we could look across the deck, and the next couple minutes later we were down below and we were even with the ship's screw. So it was one of the very rough things in making transfer. Now, there are many other ships that are waiting for their chance to be part of the Iwo Jima operation. And out at sea, destroyer escorts were patrolling back and forth to safeguard against Japanese submarines. The truth of the matter is that Japanese submarines at that stage of the war were not doing very much in the way of trying to hit our ships because of their tactics. One of them was that they kept their submarines in support of their battleships and aircraft carriers, and they weren't in this vicinity. The other reason is that they had islands that were bypassed, that we had taken the islands around them, but left islands back at sea that they still operated on. Well, those people were starving to death if they didn't get some kind of food and support. And so the submarines were actually being used for that purpose. So it was a matter of tactics. Now you should know that the Japanese had a superior torpedo to the American torpedo during much of that war. So as far as their ability to sink ships, they had the ability. It's just that one was their tactics were wrong, and the other one, they were desperate to save their people out at sea. Well, we went from that unloading on the Higgins boats through the channel between Tinian and Saipan, and waiting for us was LST 715, the DeKalb City or County LST. And they picked us up and we went into quarters. Now you should know that the center of a LST is the boat deck, and it has its alligator tractors on that as the landing craft. But on each side of the LST are the quarters for the troops that will occupy it. And there is a galley running back and forth on either side so that you can get from the front of the LST to the back of the LST without getting out of it, except for the exits as such. The following day, we did a practice landing on Saipan. It lined up a number of LSTs in a row. We went on down into the lower boat deck and got into the alligator tractors. And when we got fairly close to the island, they called the exercise off. But it was a practice operation. When we got back out, I could see the sugar mill that was on Saipan, which was a marker of one of the operations that had been there as a Japanese operation before it was taken by our troops. Now, Saipan and Tinian were the bases for our B-29s, along with Guam. And Tinian in particular was important for that reason. We then made our trip on its way toward Iwo Jima. Ahead of us were the destroyer escorts, and they would go so far in one direction, and then they would correct it and go zigzag in another direction. And when they made their move to change directions, then our LST would stop temporarily and make its change too. So we were zigging and zagging our way on up there. All the time that we were doing that and getting ready for the Iwo Jima operation, our Air Force was softening up Iwo Jima with flights up there and bombing them. In addition to that, the island was shelled by our fleet as it visited Iwo Jima on one occasion. Now, Iwo Jima was called Iwo Ta, and as Iwo Ta, they took a census in 1943, and there were 1,018 males, 485 females, 192 households, and a school, along with 200 cows, 200 pigs, and 3 goats. And when the possibility of war was going to take place, they evacuated everything out of there except for the cows, pigs, and goats. And then it was militarized. And the Japanese brought in some of their best units out of Manchuria, along with an untrained group of recruits, and then a very fierce fighting group out of Kagoshima and the southern Kyushu. Along with that, they brought in a very capable artillery commander. The overall Japanese commander was Kiribayashi with the army, and he had some 17,500 troops. Ishimashu was the rear admiral in charge of the Japanese Marines, and they had about 5,500 of the Japanese Marines. There was a disagreement in tactics between the two. Ishimaru wanted to fight a war at the beaches. Kiribayashi said, lay back, stay by the caves, fight them individually as they come to you. Use your artillery effectively. So those are the two different approaches. Most of the time then we made contact with the Japanese, we were running into Ishimaru group because of the areas that we ourselves were involved in. The day before the actual landing, or that night I should say, I was awake on deck on the LST. Could look out in the horizon and see a flash of light. The flash of light kept getting bigger as we kept getting closer. After we got so close, a sound started coming with it. Then pretty soon both the flash of light and the sound came together, and it became louder and louder. As day broke, we could see Mount Suribachi because we were approaching it from the south. Our ship then made its way along with other LSTs and the destroyer escorts all the way around the west coast of Iwo Jima, past the north coast, and then it set up behind the battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and destroyers escorts that were lined up on the west side or east side, firing at the island. Now there is a map of the island that is a naval map, and in it it shows the assignments of each battleship, each cruiser, each destroyer, or each destroyer escort. They didn't fire randomly at the island. Each one had its assigned task of what to do. From the viewpoint of history, it would have been better had they had firing at certain strategic spots, but they didn't know the strategic spots, and as a result, of course, the Japanese had certain advantages in that respect. The final headquarters for Kiribayashi was up at Katino Point in the very northwest corner. That's exactly the furthest point from where our naval artillery was. And it was also sheltered by Hill 362 and by most of Iwo Jima. So it was on the west side north, and we were actually doing our firing from the east side and further south. Now, the morning of the actual landing, we were entertained by receiving a breakfast of steak and eggs. After being fed that well, we went down into the boat deck, got into the amphibious tractor, and then they opened the front of the LST, set down the ramp, and we were in the sea. For a while, we went to a position and then circled. The reason you circle is that the units actually have a problem if they were to bounce with the waves of washing in and going down. But because of the fact you circle, you smooth out the waves. Well, we circled as a group until such time as the Higgins boat, that was to be the lead Higgins boat, dropped the flag, and then all the LST, all the Higgins boats, or all of the alligator tractors lined up, and we headed toward the beach. Ahead of us was a snub-nosed Amtrak that was supposed to fire at Japanese targets as it came in. As it got closer to the beach, they saw that they couldn't climb up on the beach because the terrace was too steep, so they just turned around and went back. In my case, our Amtrak landed at the beach in the first wave, and then they lowered the ramp and back, and then we were on our own to make our way across the island. By this time, the Japanese had started to fire artillery, but for the most part, they had held off firing until they had a big enough buildup of troops coming in or already on the beach. So I was in the lucky wave in that respect. First thing I remember is the guy losing his leg at the knee. He was on his back, trying to keep the blood from spurting out, and he was doomed to die, but we were under orders to cross the island and let the corpsmen take care of the wounded. And so I was up and out, and I had found a spot in the terrace that I could get through and into. When I got up to the top, I looked at what was happening. I looked at what was happening, and I could see an artillery pattern being fired by the Japanese. One round would drop to my right, one round would drop way out in front of me, but almost even with me. Another round would go down to my left, and then a final round would explode fairly close to me in front. About that time, Austin Montgomery, one of my buddies, came up beside me, and I pointed out to him what I had seen, and I said if we make our way through this pattern, because they're firing it consecutively and on time, we can probably make it through. Well, we did that, and it worked out for us. We spent most of the rest of the day trying to cross the island and saw nobody for a long, long time. One thing we could see is to the south of us, Marines of the 28th Marines were trying to climb Mount Suribachi. There's a step up to get to the base of the mountain, and that's where they were fighting, and we could see them from a distance. The other thing we saw was the Navy Air Wing or Marine Air Wing coming off the jump carriers and the aircraft carrier Saratoga, making runs at dropping bombs at the base of Mount Suribachi to the left of us. They would fly in, drop their bombs, and then pull out, circle back, and then they would land again on the jump carrier to rearm. We could see this happening one time after the other, and then something happened. One of the pilots dropped his bomb, but instead of pulling out of the dive, he went right in with it. Apparently he had been shot and shot down. It exploded, and with that they called off any more airstrikes on the base of the island, and we continued on our way. When we got near the end of the tarmac of Motoyama number 1, a lone Japanese soldier started firing at us. The bullets whizzed through the air. We fired back at him. He disappeared over the tarmac, and that's the last we saw of him. When we got to the other side of the island, it was getting near dark, and we found that there was a group of 8 or 10 guys already there. And how they got there, I'll never know. It was from our platoon. The leading man was Dewey Flynn. It wasn't too long after that, a shot rang out in the dark, and Dewey Flynn was shot. He got it in the stomach. Now, when you end up getting shot in the stomach, you start mixing digestive juices with blood. And when that happens, you get peritonitis. And so Dewey Flynn was wounded, but he was destined to die. So he would be the first casualty that I knew out of my unit, although we started with 51. And basically what happened is that only about 35 or 40 ever showed up in the end. So some of them were wounded or killed out on the beaches after we had gone through, but I don't know who those were or what happened to them. After that, we set up a final protective line for the night. Now that's putting machine guns in crossfire sections, followed by BAR men that cover desolate areas in between, followed by mortars that are firing from behind to cover up holes in the line that are behind that. And then following that, we have riflemen in between. The mortarmen ended up firing parachute flares. And when the flares come down, they end up lighting up the front lines. It went on for a couple hours, and then somebody got the idea that the Japanese were attacking down Motoyama number 1 and coming at us. All of a sudden, all the machine guns opened up, all the BARs were opening up, and then somebody said ceasefire because it was a false alarm. Firing stopped. The Japanese did not try to penetrate, and that was the end of the night. We gradually made our way to the north on the west side of the island. There are a couple things that happened at that time. One night we were assigned, and we would move up at night, by the way, because that way the Japanese couldn't see us. One night we moved up, and I was with Mike Ladich right on the very west coast shore. It was kind of a dewy, rainy night. We dug our foxhole in the sand, and our foxhole kept sinking in from the sides on it because it didn't have any shape to it due to the sand. And it was wet. And then we heard somebody crawling toward us. And we thought there might be a Japanese there. And so as a result, we hugged down close to that hole that we had created as we could. And we stood ready with our guns in case he came over the edge. It would crawl, and then it would stop. Crawl, and then it would stop. We were wondering any moment he's going to come on. And then a flare lit up, and all of a sudden we recognized that a land crab was in the bottom of our foxhole. And he was trying to crawl out, and then he would fall back and rest to crawl again. We threw him out, and that was the end of that night. Another time I moved up into the center of the line with Mike. We dug our foxhole, and the Japanese got word that we were advancing, so they opened up with their artillery from the base of the amphitheater ahead of us. One round dropped in front of us. The other round went straight over our head and down the field a little, and the final round went down the field quite a ways before it exploded. And then it repeated. Then all of a sudden our artillery opened up. And it wasn't just our artillery, one gun, it was a battery. The battery rounds went around, and then it was quiet. The next day, we woke up to find out where we were. And we had actually located very close to being under a palm tree. Had one of the shells hit the palm tree, we had been covered with artillery scrap. Fortunately, it didn't happen. From there on, we moved on up to the edge of the amphitheater, and there several things were to be seen. These Japanese had been hit by napalm by one of our tanks, and they had been burned. We basically waited there for our next action to take place. We should have been forewarned, because one of the things that I spotted there was a long triangular board with Japanese writing on it. And I suspect that that writing said, "This is not an area for you to be in. Safeguard yourself, stay away from it," in Japanese, to forewarn of theirs. Well, it was from this takeoff point that we went into what is called Death Valley. And in the book, Battle Wounds of Iwo Jima, it's a description of what happened in Death Valley as far as I was concerned. But what happened is our whole company moved into the valley by running into position. And what we didn't know is that the Japanese had taken it upon themselves to do what you call a rear action operation. They had spider traps along the outer edge type thing, and when we overran the position, they then fired from machine guns at us from in back. And they had pre-dug positions to actually trip us into thinking we were finding safety, because it was a trench that had went from their fire spider trap on down. And because of the action of battle of war and gunning and shelling, it was not easily revealed to us. What ended up happening is I ran forth on the right-hand side, and George Piotrowski was ahead of me, and it was a shell hole, and he landed in it. I landed in it right after him, and he said, "Get out of here, because I don't want you to draw fire." I looked around for another place to go and didn't see any, so I stayed. Another guy in our unit was named Perry. He also came and landed in the same shell hole. Piotrowski told him, "Go find another place. We don't want to draw fire." Perry moved back, and he went into one of those pre-dug trenches. The machine gun opened up. Now that machine gun ended up sending bullets in my direction and his direction at the same time. I had a shovel in the back of my pack, and it cut the shovel handle right off. 2 of the bullets went into my pack, but I didn't get hit. But C.J. Perry got it through the buttocks, and C.J. Perry got it in the head. It blew the back of his skull out. We were then ordered to evacuate back out, and I was helping to get C.J. Perry out of there. And what happened was his brain had slipped into the shell-like egg part of the skull, that is the thing. And Bradley, who was our corpsman, gently tipped his head over, causing the brain to move back into position. He put the skull back on, put a banquet thing on, put sulfadug in, put him in a morphine treatment, and then he was evacuated out and taken all the way back to the beaches. I never knew what happened to Perry until years later. But then I ended up attending a Marine Corps reunion at Peoria, Illinois, and there was C.J. Perry. He survived it, but he had been taken to Guam, to Honolulu, to the Naval Hospital at Bethesda in Washington, D.C., and he managed to survive, although he never was able to work or do anything for the rest of his life because he was handicapped. But he's an example of a miracle in medicine on the front lines. Others in that unit didn't have it so good. The Japanese opened up with artillery from behind the cliffs that were in front of us. And there I have a picture of the actual cliffs and the amphitheater as it looked. There were all kinds of casualties. Billy Menzies came up from in back along with a guy by the name of Goff and Louis Heminger. Goff ended up taking off his helmet in order to fire a bazooka at the spider trap. A rifleman in the spider trap fired before he got to fire his bazooka. Took out the back of Goff's head, killed right there. Billy Menzies picked up the bazooka, fired it, and took out the spider trap. That was our most formidable thing. The other thing that happened is the Japanese had a 300 millimeter shell that they fired in a rocket formation. It would ride up a track like a roller coaster track, and that would launch it. And it was like 8 or 10 feet long. And it was launched from near the area between the two airfields Moriyama 1 and 2. And those shells would then sail through the air all the way to Mount Suribachi on the southern part of the island. When they would launch it, we would hear the squealing because the wheels that supported the rocket looked like a flying LP gas tank. And it would squeal as they would launch, and then it would fly free so that the wheels in that section would fall back down. But the shell in turn would continue on its way toward Mount Suribachi. And the other thing it would do, because of the airflow behind it, it would go woof, 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 woof through the air as it was going through. Well, they launched one of those shells into our area. It was on a short thing, and it exploded out in front of me. And when it exploded, it sent dirt and dust all different directions. And it confused the Japanese as much as it confused us. And that was our way of getting back out of there. Now, a couple guys had unusually wonderful events happen to them. Peter J. Rondero, who I already mentioned as losing his BAR, ended up getting a bullet that came between his helmet and liner on the side. The bullet followed all the way around in the helmet and came down on the opposite side and hit the lower lobe of his ear, giving him a minor wounded in action, Purple Heart. He was lucky. One of the machine gunners, Wallace, back at the takeoff point, got a bullet directly into his helmet. But instead of it going through his liner, it ricocheted off the liner and went around and went out the back of his helmet. So when you took the liner out, it looked like it went right through his head. But he survived that type of thing. Now, little Peter Pettit was not as fortunate. A Japanese artillery shell landed right where he was. And so you would either say he's missing in action or killed in action, because there was no way you could find any parts of Peter. He just had it. But we had lost about 40 casualties, and Dr. Brown, who wrote the book Battle Wounds of Iwo Jima, cites that among other things. One of the other things he cited was one of the friends of John Bradley, who was part of the group that helped to raise the flag, although he was not a flag raiser himself. But one of his friends was Ralph Iwatowski from Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And Ralph was captured by the Japanese in the area ahead of the cliffs to the north. The Japanese not only captured him, but they cut out his tongue, took his eyes out, poured acid down his back, burned him with cigarettes, put bamboo shoots down under his fingernails. In other words, they treated him as extremely horribly as you possibly could before they hung him and killed him. They even took his testicles out and put them in his mouth. So Dr. Brown in this book cites that as one example of Japanese cruelty. Now, after Death Valley, or the Battle of the Amphitheater, we went back to the base of Mount Suribachi. And we got back there for rest. And one day we were eating a mixture of canned meat and vegetables that came off an Amtrak. In fact, the Amtrak came by us and where it was going and who it was going with or for, I don't know. But it just so happened that cases of mixed fruit and a case of mixed meats and vegetables, canned, slipped off the back of that Amtrak by accident, and I helped to get them reduced to fall off. But anyway, we were eating, and I went over to sit on a knoll, and Mike Ladich came over to sit beside me. And when he sat down and I sat down at the same thing, all of a sudden the knoll collapsed. We were sitting on a dead Japanese, and a whole bunch of gas came up and maggots and a curdling mess of blood and pus and what have you. People often said, well, what did you do? All we did was we finished eating, because that was one of the better meals we had because we had nothing but K rations up until that time. After we had rested for a few days at the base of Mount Suribachi, we went back up north. And in order to do that, we went up on a road that the Japanese had done that went through a canyon area on the west side of the island. When we went through that canyon area, there was a dead Japanese that had been lifted by artillery rounds so that his body actually extended over a timber, and as a result, his body fluids were flowing into his skull. His neck had been broken, and so as a result, the skin was all that was holding the head in position. One of the guys ended up picking up a stone and throwing it. He hit the skull. It was in a morning type situation with dew coming off from the sea, so it was foggy in there. But the smell of Japanese with a fish diet spread all the way through the canyon as we went through. When we got through, we got up to what is called the village or community of Nishi. And at Nishi, I ended up having 4 things happen that I thought were of interest. First of all, this house was kind of blown apart. And after seeing a number of houses in Japan, I found out that they had a unique way of architecture of building them. They were generally built about 2 feet off from the ground. Generally next to the house was a shed where they did the cooking. Then the house itself had mats on it. And then also what was true is it was timber framed. And then there was boards on it that were like 3/8-inch thick boards around the outside. Well, when artillery hits it, it doesn't necessarily destroy the timber frame, but it blows the boards out. So this house was blown apart. And one fellow was passing me on the left, and another one was passing me on the right, and I could have either gone around the house and continued on my way, or I could walk right through the house, one side to the other. When I got into the house, I ended up finding 4 things. One was a set of binoculars. And these are they, although the binoculars aren't here anymore because my son mislaid them. Some Lucky Strike green cigarettes. Now that's special because of the fact that during World War II, and part of the war effort, and to save dye, to dye things green, Lucky Strike had agreed to dye their packages no more. And so they advertised, Lucky Strike green has gone to war. Well, the Japanese operated tobacco plants in the Philippines and Indonesia, and some were Lucky Strike plants. So undoubtedly the Japanese had Lucky Strike greens. The other thing I found was a can of Russian product. I didn't know what it was, but I knew it was Russian writing. When we got to the north, I opened it up, and it was very rich beef, canned, that the Japanese apparently bought from the Russians. The final thing I found was a manual, a corpsman's manual or a medic's manual, depending on if you're in the Army or in the Marine Corps. But I had those 4 things from there. The other thing I found as we went up north was a leaflet. And that leaflet is right here. I had thought that the leaflet was actually one of them dropped by our Air Force to encourage the Japanese to surrender, because what it does is it shows some dead Japanese being shot down, and it's written in Japanese language. What I found out was that wasn't the case at all. What had happened is in the last stages of the Japanese defense of the island, a Japanese plane had flown over and dropped leaflets to try to encourage their servicemen to fight on. And so when I got the language that was on the backside decoded by a woman down in Madison, Wisconsin, she said, this leaflet is actually a picture that's at the war center in Tokyo, and it's from the Russia or the Chinese-Japanese war in Formosa. And when they were trying to take a mountain area in Formosa, a certain lieutenant had fought on bravely. And what it was suggesting is that's what the Japanese should do, is fight to the end as such. Well, from there we went up to the north end of the island. When we got there, our artillery had ended up hitting the Japanese out in the open, and there were a number of Japanese there. We had ropes with us, and we ended up pulling the Japanese away from the areas where we were going to dig in, and then giving them a shallow burial by putting dirt over their bodies. I ended up pulling on one individual, and when I tipped him over on the other side, I found that he had a pistol. So I ended up taking that pistol. It's a Mauser type pistol, and it's a Japanese officer's type. It's 7.4 as far as its caliber is concerned. The other thing I found near at hand was a rifle. This is called a Model 99 Asuka. It fires a 31 caliber or 7.7 round. It's very accurate. I had it in my foxhole, and then we were moved to Catino Point to fight in the last action on Iwo Jima for our troops. And I left the rifle behind in the foxhole wrapped up in my poncho, because earlier one of the guys had thought that I was a Japanese in the middle of the night, and he threw a phosphorus grenade into our foxhole. We got out of the foxhole in time, but my poncho didn't. And so as a result, what was left of my poncho, I wrapped in the rifle, and I left it there thinking that when we got back from Catino Point, we'd go back to the same spot. We didn't. We were taken off the line on March 16th down to the Japanese cemetery as our camping site. And when we were then asked to go along to retrieve a dead Marine, basically, I noticed when we were coming back from picking up that Marine that we were going past the same spot where I left my rifle. And so I asked the driver to stop. And he said, well, I can understand it's getting to you guys. Well, what had happened is this Marine we picked up was bloated, and air was being let out as we were bouncing along. And big Japanese silk flies of different colors were flying around, and then they would re-land again, and then more order would come out. But we were tolerant of it because we were in front, his body was in back. But the driver stopped. I went over to the foxhole where the guy, another Marine, was actually occupying, and I said, can I use your foxhole for a little while? He said, sure, I guess so, and he got out. I ended up digging onto the hard sulfur bottom, got down to the poncho and came out with a rifle. He said, how did you know it was there? I said, I put it there. I took it, got back in the truck, and we went back to the cemetery. The driver went on with the body to the 5th Marine Division cemetery and back. And so that's how I got the rifle. Now, one thing about this rifle that's different than those that were given to most of the Marines on Japan after the war is it has a chrysanthemum right at this point right here. And that chrysanthemum was generally ground off when Japanese surrendered their arms to our side. So this one you can see has the chrysanthemum still on, and that's the evidence thereof.
And that's because that chrysanthemum was the
symbol of
the imperial of the emperor.
That's right, yes. Now, while we were up at that point, we were short of the NCOs. And while we were waiting to make our next advance up, a artillery pilot came flying over. And he was flying almost even with us, only slightly higher than we were as he went by. We could see him as plain as could be, and he was very close to us. When he got downwind, he turned around and came back on another pass. When he got even with us, but he was blotted out because he was lower and below a little hillet, we heard a machine gun open up. The next thing we know, we saw puffs of smoke. The motor had stopped. Then there was a crash. It was all below us on a sill on the north end of Iwo Jima. That was as much as we knew at that time. Then they sent up a replacement by the name of Benjamin Moffat, a staff sergeant. And Benjamin Moffat all of a sudden got out of his foxhole and he headed down in a ravine that was straight ahead of us. We didn't know what he was about because he hadn't given us any orders. He hadn't said anything. He just went down there. And then a knee mortar round opened up. And then he was squealing down there. And so a group of us went down to try to retrieve him. And when we got down there, he was laying on his stomach and his face was as red as a beet. And when we turned him over to tip him on a poncho to carry him back out, it all gurgled out. Both his blood and guts were blown open. And his face went from deep red ruby to kind of ashen gray. He died right there. Now, later on, when we got back up there, we went to the foxhole where he was taking off from, and we discovered all kinds of little small bottles of whiskey. He had been given a couple boxes of that stuff to share with our command. And he had drunk them all himself and then had gone down there. But before I went out of the ravine down below, I looked around. And there was a motorcycle parked near the cliff facing back toward the island. It was one of those ammo carriers that had two wide wheels in back and then an ammo box sideways on it. It was a Japanese military motorcycle. The other thing I noticed was the pilot. That plane had come down and its landing gear had collapsed. The motor had broken free. The fiber had all burned off, but the rest of it was intact. And there was Leon Ellsworth, the pilot, still holding the stick, but he was burned to a crisp. Now, I wrote about that to Colonel Waterhouse, who was a Marine on Iwo Jima, who got wounded in the arm, and he got going to art school after World War II, and as well, he became the artist in residence. And so he gave me a picture. The next thing they know, they sent up another replacement. His name was Gunnery Sergeant Hirschberger, Steve Hirschberger. He was a China Marine. He had also served in the battle for Tarawa. In fact, he told us the story about coming in at Tarawa, and they had misguided or misjudged the tides there. And the result, the Higgins boats were hitting the coral coming in, and the guys would have to give out and wade in. And then because of you wading in, the level of the water and sand from the wading in point to the shore wasn't always the same. All of a sudden, you could be going along walking, and then you're in water over your head, and you got a pack on and a rifle and a helmet and all your equipment, and the only thing you can do is drown. But what ended up happening was that Steve Hirschberger was riding in a later wave with a colonel, and the colonel was in back of him. And they were conversing about what they saw along this whole line of what is called Bettino, the island of Tarawa. All of a sudden, the colonel stopped talking. He turned around to see what the colonel had happened to stop him from talking. The colonel didn't have a head. An artillery shell had come through and cut him right off. So this is Steve Hirschberger's story. Well, he gave us orders to go to the right. And I was at the point. And when I went forward, hit the deck, Austin Montgomery came along, did the same thing. Then Mike Ladich did the same thing. It's a way of advancing step by step. About that time, a machine gun opened up right in front of us. They had been observing us for days and hadn't done anything about it. But when we ended up trying to advance on them, they decided that was the point they had to make to fire back. Well, they didn't get us because we were down, but they got Steve Hirschberger. Killed him right there. Well, after a few days of that moving forward in that position, company came up on the other side. And Lieutenant Jack Loomis was in charge of that unit. He was the executive officer of Company F, but they had given him a rifle command because we were now down so low in officers. Jack Loomis stepped on a mine, blew his leg off, left his other leg just barely on. They exported him or evacuated him to the hospital, field hospital, and he died right there. They awarded him the Congressional Medal of Honor. His unit took with a tank, took out that emplacement where the machine gun had fired on me, and that had cleared the area along the way. That particular mined area was where our truck came through, 3/4 ton truck, to pick up that dead guy. So if there had been another mine in that area and we had hit it, we'd have probably not been around either. From there we went to Catino Point. Catino Point was the last defense area that the Japanese had in the very northwest corner of the island. It had been made into a concrete bunker 100 feet by 100 feet with rooms. It was the headquarters for Kiribayashi. There were some sea stacks with cliffs on either side. A little Japanese got up on top of one of the sea stacks, and I think it took 100 rounds to bring him down, because everybody fired at one time and nobody took credit, but he was dead. We also at that time tried to eliminate that particular position by lowering gasoline with shape charges and composition 2 satchels over the cliff facing toward the opening in the cliff facing the sea. When we'd let off one of those charges, we could hear the rifle shells inside explode because they would set fire to those areas. But what we didn't know is that's where the headquarters for Kiribayashi was, and that's where he had about 350 or 400 of his followers in that area yet at the last stages of the battle. I almost got killed up there too. I got ahead of that machine gun in that area between the sea stacks and the sea. And when I got ahead of it, the machine gun on the side started opening up. The only way I could evacuate out was to go back the way I came. And if I did, I was going right into machine gun fire. Cliff Olson was in our unit. He recognized where the machine gun fire was coming from. He began to fire into the aperture of it. That stopped him from firing. I got back out. When I got back out, we were trying to get on another side of the Japanese emplacement, and a sailor came up. He was dressed in dress blues. We asked him what he was doing up there. We said, just hunting for a few souvenirs. He said, this is a dangerous area. There's no reason for you to be here. Oh, I'll find something, he said. About that time, a sniper's rifle broke out. He dropped dead. I had another experience up there. I was pulled off the line. I was told that there was a place where runners went through and they were getting shot by snipers, and that I should be on one side where they knew the sniper didn't see me and warn them when they come through. The only problem was that the guy came around the corner, and then that's when I could talk to him. But I didn't have any forewarning to talk to him. Well, what ended up happening is I waited A guy came around the corner. I said, "Keep moving. You can get shot." The guy says, "What?" He stopped. A sniper's bullet rang out. He got shot in the arm or the shoulder. He dropped his load and disappeared going backwards. Now I did one of two things. I either caused them to only be wounded, or I saved them from being killed. But irregardless, that's what happened. They came back and retrieved me and got me back in my own line again. But the thing is, I often thought, here I'm sitting out in the open, any guy could come along in Japanese and fire at me and I wouldn't see him before he got his first round in. But it was like waiting and not knowing what was going to happen again. From there we went back to the Japanese cemetery. We were off the line. I took a picture of what was left of our group at that stage, and it amounted to 14 guys. Same thing. Yeah.
Okay.
So we had started out with 51. We ended up with 14. There's only 11 on that picture. I took the picture, and the lieutenant and Billy Menges were down at the dedication for the 5th Marine Division Cemetery at that time. So that was what was left of us. Now there's one other thing that I would call to your attention, and that is I was asked by Nyland Nelson, who was a runner, to go with him to carry a message to headquarters. And that was along the cliffs in the amphitheater between the cemetery and between Motoyama number 1 and Motoyama number 2. When we were going that way, a lone Japanese straggler fired a machine gun at us from a great distance. He missed us, but then he stopped firing. We continued on our way. But apparently our engineering unit had discovered a cache of Japanese arms hidden in a cave that was not tunneled or anything. It was just a tunneled out area, but not going anywhere, with boxes of Japanese ammunition and so forth. One of the items that they had, of course, was hand grenades. So I took 2 hand grenades out of the box and I said, "You go on and finish your mission, and when you come back, I'll see if I can disarm them." And so I ended up getting a Japanese hand grenade. I took it apart by screwing out the fuse. I pulled the pin, blew the fuse, and then I took out the inside, and that had, of course, an explosive pack that was in the form of a gel. Then I put it back together, and I did that to 2 of them. I gave one to Nyland, and I had one myself. And this is how I came by a Japanese hand grenade. Now, the last night we were on Iwo Jima, it got to be near morning. And all of a sudden, rifle fire opened up over between Motoyama number 1 and number 2. What had happened is General Kurabayashi and about 350 of what was left of his command decided to do a walk-in on the Air Force's pilots, crews, and other Air Force command there, Army Air Force. it wasn't a matter of charging in, it was a matter of walking in. What they did is they took English-speaking Japanese officers and put them in front. And they talked to each other like it was a change of the guard. That threw everybody off. But then what they would do is take their swords or bayonets, cut open the tent sides, and then attack the people inside. And because there were 2 officers to a 6-man tent and 4 crewmen to a 6-man tent, they were able to kill people right off the bat. And so they went through the night fighters. They went through the P-51 fighters. They went through the air crews of both of them. They went through a signal corps. They went through a communications corps. They went through a hospital unit. They went through a CV unit. Unit after unit the Japanese were going through. Then they finally came upon the Black Marines. There was a Marine unit that was all colored, called the Pioneer Battalion. And the Pioneer Battalion was supposed to evacuate just as we were that same day. But instead of that, they were the last line of duty. They opened up, they found 40 swords, and there probably were more, because when there's a sword, you don't end up letting anybody know about it, because the officers end up saying, well, that's part of the command. It's our sword. So colored guys in particular, no doubt hid swords, because that was the only way that they could keep them taken away from them. But anyway, it killed something like 200 or 250 Japanese. They captured 18 or 20 of them. But it was the last hurrah for Kiribayashi and his corps. Now, Kiribayashi was wounded. He was escorted off the battlefield by some of his troops, and he disappeared forever. They still have not found out where Kiribayashi is buried or what happened to him. But he was the last hurrah. Now that day, we got on a Higgins boat. We went out to the ship Storm King. We got aboard the Storm King and had our picture taken. And that picture shows what was left of Fox Company. So we started with over 250, and we ended up with about 40. And of course, that's the story of Iwo Jima. From Iwo Jima, we went back to Hawaii to Hilo. And we left on March 27th. We arrived back in April. When we got at Hilo, they took us to Hanako on the narrow gauge railroad, flat cars. One of the things that was very interesting is that the railroad passes underneath some of the roadways with bridges over the top. And we were hailed as heroes by the Japanese, or by the Hawaiians. Most of the Hawaiians on the big island of Hawaii were Japanese origin because they were doing the hard work in the sugarcane fields. These were their families greeting us as heroes when we had just got through spending time trying to kill their kin in terms of history. Now, over on the right-hand side there are pictures of all kinds of Japanese families that we found in the wallets or packets of the Japanese.
More.
Well, the point is that they have families just like us. When we got back to Camuella, we began to train for the invasion of Japan. That took us to the northern part of the island where King Kamehameha statue is. And there's a picture of a gorge of where he trained. Because we were supposed to invade Japan in Kyushu, south of Nagasaki and north of Kagoshima on the west side of the island, the terrain features were like that. So it was one of the simulations that you do in preparation for an invasion. What happened, however, was that on August 6, 1945, they dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima. And I, of course, have the orders for the pilot over there on what to do. Now, one of the pilots was a person named Nesbitt, and he's the one who provided this to our unit. He was always grateful to the Marines because he said, we saved 2,200 plus B-29s by taking the island, and that in turn saved 24,000 airmen, because there are 10 airmen on each B-29. So you have it. Now there's a picture of the B-29, yes. And there's also a picture of Iwo Jima's airfield showing some of the wrecks or some of the planes that had to land. On August 9th, a second atomic bomb was dropped on Nagasaki. One was called Fat Boy. I don't recall what the other one was, Little
Boy.
Little Boy and Fat Boy, or Fat
Boy and, yeah, Tall Boy, that was it, I think.
Yeah. But anyway, those were the two different bombs. They were not identical. When the atomic bomb was dropped on Nagasaki, some people were close to the bomb and some were further away. So they became casualties. And it so happened that I was at Saga. Well, Saga was one of the towns that wasn't burned out, because there were 64 cities burned out. And that was one that was bypassed. Well, as a result, the refugees from Nagasaki were sent to various places, some of which were sent to Saga.
You want this?
And no, but a Japanese doctor along with Dr. Brown of our unit, gave medical aid to those people. And that is a systematic undertaking of what their age was, what their sex is, what damage was done to them, what their blood count is, all kinds of technical information on about 180 of them. So it's a very detailed thing. The Atomic Energy Commission saw that as among the papers. Dr. Brown shared it with him. He gave it to me before he died. Now we lost 6,821 killed in action on Iwo Jima. We lost 19,217 wounded. Another 300 were lost on the Bismarck when it was sunk by kamikaze pilots on February 21st. And I had the opportunity to see one of their planes fly low over our position in that rainy, sunsetting night, to see the ship burning off to our west coast and not knowing what it was. But then later on, reading the book, The Last Zero Pilots, and in it they talked about where they came from in Kyushu, how they gathered at Chichijima, how they flew the mission, how some of them were sent to their death because they were going to be the ones that were the kamikazes, how some were sent to observe, to overlook, to see that they had carried out the mission and how successful it was. They hit the Saratoga, which was the oldest aircraft carrier in the fleet, and disabled it. They sunk the Bismarck C. They did damage to another jump carrier. They did damage to an LST, and they did damage to a troop transport. One of the ships that had followed after from Saipan up to Iwo Jima was the very ship that we were on, the Highlands, that had taken us from Hawaii all the way to Saipan. That ship was on hand and saved 120 of the Bismarck C crew who jumped into the water and were saved from that sinking ship. So that's tie-in. Now, my tour of duty in Japan starts out at Sasebo. And there was an interesting thing because there's a long, narrow channel leading into the harbor at Sasebo. In order for us to know how to go in the channel, we needed a pilot. And so a Japanese pilot was taken on to guide us into the harbor following the end of the war. When we got into the inner harbor, to the south of us was a Japanese aircraft carrier that was still being built. The plates were of different color and of different stages of rust, and the ship was actually listing to one side. When we got into the inner harbor, there was a building going on of creating submarines. And so we could see the fabrication going on to create a submarine, and that's it. Then we went down the main drag into the town. That's us evacuating off from our ship, which was called the Sieverts, and on to...
This looks more like when you came in to occupy.
That's right. Yeah, at Sasebo.
Okay.
And then the picture right alongside of it was where our platoon was sent, and we were to be the first CP in Japan for the 5th Marine Division. Remember I told you that our unit had been the only one to hit its target the first day, and so we were honored by given that opportunity. And underneath that place was the Japanese Air Control Center for all southern Japan. And it was maps, one set on the wall leading from Guam, Saipan, and Tinian to Japan by way of the Banan Islands or Iwo Jima. The other one was a route that came from China, Formosa, or Taiwan, and the Philippines. So they were plotting it. And then there were caverns, a cave set up with all kinds of shortwave radio equipment for information being brought in so it could be posted. So that was underground headquarters is what it amounted to. Now I was given the job of guarding the entrance on the rear side. That's what's interesting about that is that the person doing the photography wanted me to get out of the picture so he could just take a picture of the entrance. And I told him, I said, well, if you put me in it, you'll have some perspective. And he agreed then, and I got taken into the picture. But you can see that that building where I'm guarding matches the picture on a previous page on the underground facility. Now, from Sasebo, we went to Saga. From Saga, we went to Krume, and Krume was burned out except for the city hall. So it stood out by itself in concrete, but you could see where the streets were and where the buildings must have been, but they're all wooden, all burned out. From there we went to Kagoshima and saw the same thing. But at Kagoshima we saw the defense that they were going to set up, because Kagoshima is a crater, but it's sea level crater. And it has walls that open up on either side, but the wall of the crater was open so that you could enter from the sea. Well, what they were going to do is set up their artillery along the interior side of the crater so that our Navy gunfire couldn't do damage to them. And then they were going to fire down on us as we landed on the beaches inside. Also on either side, they had explosive gunboats loaded with explosive charges. So they could come out at either side when our Higgins boats or our alligator tractors came out, so they could ram us and blow us up. And of course, one Japanese 26 or 15 or 18 Marines was a willing charge as far as they were concerned. We saw all kinds of equipment that way. I was also in on the surrender of various Japanese divisions, and what would happen is there would be a field, no Japanese soldiers present other than the cadre, and there would be machine guns all lined up, rifles all lined up, swords all lined up. Swords came first, but then artillery as such. We would accept the surrender and the equipment, and of course among the things I got was this rifle. And that's called the Model 38. And it was actually first used in 1908 in the Russo-Japanese War era. I looked it up on the computer and they said that this is a very accurate rifle, very well made. The only thing is it fires a 6.5 round, which is about a 25 caliber. So they wanted something with more caliber to it. The other rifle is a 31 caliber. Now the other day, Gibbs Stolborough was over, a person named Jolly had made a contribution of a bayonet to the Historical Society. He wanted to know what that bayonet fit. So we tried the bayonet out on this rifle, and it fits both of the rifles because they're actually identical in that respect. It's a Model 30 bayonet. So we had the connective links between the two. From Kagoshima, I went to Miyazaki. From Miyazaki to Miyakanojo. From Miyakanojo to Oita. From there to Beppu. From there to Hita. To there to Fukuoka. And then back to Sasebo. So I circled the whole island in this tour of Japan duty. In July of in June of 1946, I returned to the United States. Got home in time to enroll in high school. 47 of the guys who were enrolled in Wassa High School in that year were ex-servicemen. So there were a lot of 18-year-olds, 17-year-olds who served in that war. Now, as far as war is concerned, the younger they are, the better they are for the service. The reason behind it is that older people have something to live for because they have family. Younger people don't think as much about the safety of their makeup. If you do it sometime, look up the Civil War and note that the average age was something like 16. There were 14-year-olds, 13-year-olds, even 10-year-old drummer boys. But the thing is, they were very young in general. And not only that, in the Civil War, if you didn't want to serve, you could hire out somebody to serve. And what often happened is they got hired out, went over the hill, took another place for another guy in another unit in another state. So the same person might be enrolled 4 or 5 times as a young guy and get away with it. Of course, they didn't have IDs, didn't have fingerprints, didn't have pictures of the servicemen, so that was it. I finished up high school in 1 year, went to the University Extension for 2 years, and then came the Korean War. I was in the reserve. So the next thing I know, I was being called up for Marine service again. This time they recognized me for my intelligence and for my education. They ran an intelligence test and said that I was 128 to 32 in the score, which put me in a 2% category. So I got signed Great Lakes Sergeant of the Guard, taking care of the brig down there as one of the many people on that duty. And the other thing is, many, many, many people who were called back never expected to be called back, and they resented being called back, and as a result, when they got called, the MPs had to hunt them down, or the county sheriff had to hunt them down. And sometimes it was understandable. We had one guy down there, he was sitting a couple months in the brig, and I had to take him in front of Colonel Valentine to find out what they were going to do with him. And Colonel Valentine wanted his story. Well, the guy said he was out in Kansas, their wheat crop was ready to be harvested, his dad didn't have any other help, and he wanted to harvest the wheat crop before he turned himself in. So he went to the county sheriff and told him what he wanted to do. The sheriff says, yeah, we'll go along with that. Well, when that time was up, then they called him in, and then they said he was over the hill. So because he was over the hill, he was in the brig. And because we had a brig that was so full of people of that type of charge, we ended up having to wait and wait and wait for the court-martials to come through. And when they finally did get to the charge of the court-martial, Colonel Valentine said to me, he said, "This is idiotic." And what was interesting is Colonel Valentine wasn't just Colonel Valentine. He was Colonel Valentine who had been a China Marine. So he knew Chinese. So I lost Colonel Valentine. He was shipped off to North Korea and South Korea. He was one of the individuals that was at Panmunjom, or at the treaty for, I think it's Panmunjom, was it?
Yes.
Yeah. And also at Panmunjom was somebody who was related to me, and that was my aunt. She was a nurse. And interestingly enough, for a few days in history, when nobody else could communicate with the world, she was the lone communicator, because as a nurse, she could come in and out and see what was going on. And the AP couldn't do it, UPS couldn't do it. Nobody else was involved except her for a little while.
Oh, that's great.
No.
As you and I talked about before, is one of the thoughts about the intensity of the Battle of Iwo Jima is we talked about that you had 6,821 killed in basically 37 days,
Yeah.
36 days, and the number of servicemen killed during the Iraq War was 4,424.
Oh,
So consider 36 days versus 13 years.
yeah, that's extreme, the killing. Well, the Japanese, generally, their family would give them a good luck flag of some kind. Some of them had language on them. Some of them ended up having a flag on. Some of them had symbols on them. And in this case, that fellow that I found up north, where the pistol was, that was on his body. And the reason it has those two holes up in the top of it are because the material that they use is kind of a gold material, must have had acid in it, and so it ate the holes out. But that's how it originally was.
That's the uniform you actually wore?
In the Korean War, yeah, that's when I made sergeant.
Oh, the top uniform is from Korea?
Yeah, and the bottom one shows what our uniform was in Iwo Jima and also in the Korean War. The only difference is in the Korean War, there's a double layer in it that isn't there. In fact, I have a Korean War coat in the closet, and that's heavy to protect you against the cold, because that was a hell of a cold thing. In fact, I don't know if you realize it, but when we were in Japan and we were at where all those little place right there, yeah, you can show those, the whole set of them, teachers and all the, that was at a Japanese airfield, and we were doing interior guard on it. But anyway, the little Japanese girls would come to school, and they would have bare legs, and it was an unheated school. And we were using their gymnasium as our headquarters. We had the little burning oil burners. We had wool pants on. We had wool socks on. We had the over jacket safety things on. We were colder than the devil.
And they were
bare-legged. Not only that, they went out and exercised for recess in an even colder condition. We got to learn something of Japanese, so I could say "Kaga desu ka?" and "Doitashimashite," and "Shirimasen," and "Wakarimasu ka?" In other words, we learned a little Japanese as we went along. And so if somebody asks you for the first 10 numbers, it's ich, ni, san, si, go, roku, hichi, hachi, ku, and ju. when I was young. Just a boy, and asked my mother, what would it be? Will I be handsome? Will I be rich? Here's what she said to me. Say, Shara, Shara, whatever the road